What if the biggest battles in life were not fought outside, but inside the human mind? What if a single habit, something so small it takes only minutes, had the power to completely shift the direction of a person's life? There are stories shared across the world, from the streets of the United States to remote communities in Kenya, where former members of extreme spiritual and occult like groups describe one common truth: we were not defeated by force, we were defeated by discipline we could not break. Across underground testimonies from places like the USA and parts of Kenya, narratives often emerge from individuals who once lived inside secretive or extreme belief systems. Some describe environments built on fear, control, ritual, and psychological pressure, systems where routine and habit were used as tools of influence. But when these individuals leave those environments, they often report something surprising: not supernatural fear, but mental discipline fear. Because what truly breaks control is not chaos, it is consistency. But here's where the story takes a deeper turn. They didn't fear symbols, they didn't fear darkness, they didn't fear stories. They feared something far simpler: a habit so consistent that it rebuilt the human mind from the inside out. Discipline has a strange reputation in the human mind. It is often imagined as something intense, something that requires extreme effort, strict rules, or bursts of motivation. But in reality, its true form is far quieter and far more consistent. It does not depend on emotion, nor does it wait for the perfect moment. It shows up in ordinary time, in repeated actions that seem too small to matter in isolation. What makes discipline powerful is not how hard an action is, but how often it is repeated without interruption. A simple daily action, even one that lasts only a few minutes, begins to build a pattern that the mind cannot ignore. At first, it feels like effort, something that must be remembered and pushed through. But over time, something shifts. The action no longer feels like a task being forced. It begins to feel like something expected, something natural, almost automatic. This shift happens because the brain is constantly searching for efficiency. It prefers patterns over randomness, repetition over decision making. Every time an action is repeated, the brain starts reducing the energy required to perform it again. What once needed motivation begins to need less thought. This is where discipline separates itself from motivation. Motivation rises and falls depending on mood, environment, and circumstances. But discipline continues even when those conditions are not ideal. It is not driven by how a person feels in the moment, but by what they have trained themselves to do, regardless of feeling. This is why discipline often feels difficult at the beginning, because the brain is resisting change, trying to maintain familiar patterns. But once repetition crosses a certain point, resistance begins to fade, and the action starts to feel embedded within daily life. The most interesting part is how this repetition begins to influence identity. At first, a person performs an action because they want a result. But after enough repetition, the reason begins to change. The action is no longer just something they do, it becomes something that reflects who they are. The mind starts to connect repeated behavior with self image. If someone consistently acts with discipline, even in small ways, the brain begins to categorize them as a disciplined person. This categorization is powerful because it changes future behavior. People tend to act in alignment with how they see themselves. Once discipline becomes part of identity, it no longer requires the same level of effort to maintain. It becomes self reinforcing because acting against it would feel like acting against one's own nature. At the same time, discipline creates stability in an otherwise unpredictable mental environment. Thoughts, emotions, and external circumstances are constantly changing, but repeated actions create a fixed point. That fixed point becomes something the mind can rely on. It reduces internal chaos by introducing structure, even if everything else feels uncertain. The presence of a consistent habit creates a sense of control. This sense of control is not loud or dramatic, but it is deeply grounding. It allows a person to move forward even when they do not feel fully prepared or confident. The action itself becomes the source of stability rather than waiting for stability to appear before taking action. Closely connected to this is the way the mind absorbs repetition and turns it into programming. The brain does not evaluate repetition based on its value, it simply records frequency. Whatever is repeated most often becomes the dominant pattern. This means that the mind can be shaped intentionally or unintentionally, depending on what actions are performed consistently. If a person repeatedly engages in focused, constructive behavior, the brain begins to strengthen pathways associated with focus and productivity. If a person repeatedly avoids effort or delays action, the brain strengthens pathways associated with avoidance and procrastination. In both cases, the brain is doing the same thing. It is adapting to repetition. What makes this process fascinating is that it happens beneath conscious awareness. A person does not feel their brain rewiring itself in real time. They simply notice changes over time in how they think, how they react, and how easily they perform certain actions. Something that once required effort begins to feel easier, not because the task itself has changed, but because the brain has adapted to it through repetition. This is why habits can feel so powerful. They remove the need for constant decision making. Instead of asking, should I do this? The mind begins to move directly into action because it recognizes the pattern. Another layer of this transformation is how repetition influences perception. The more an action is repeated, the more familiar it becomes, and familiarity reduces resistance. The brain is naturally cautious of unfamiliar activities because they require more energy and carry more uncertainty. But once something becomes familiar, it no longer triggers the same level of resistance. This is why starting is often the hardest part of any habit. The brain is reacting not to the difficulty of the action, but to its unfamiliarity. Once that unfamiliarity fades through repetition, starting becomes easier and the habit becomes more stable. Over time, This repeated programming begins to shape not just behavior, but expectations. The mind starts predicting future actions based on past repetition. If a person has consistently followed through on small habits, the brain begins to expect low through as the default outcome. This expectation reduces internal conflict. There is less debate, less hesitation, and less resistance because the brain has already learned what usually happens next. This creates a smoother transition from intention to action, making discipline feel less like a struggle and more like a natural continuation of established patterns. This is also where confidence begins to grow in a subtle but meaningful way. Confidence is often misunderstood as something that comes from success or external validation, but at a deeper level, it is built on evidence. When a person repeatedly follows through on their own commitments, even small ones, they begin to build internal proof that they can rely on themselves. This proof becomes a foundation for confidence. It is not based on hope or assumption, but on repeated experience. The more consistent the behavior, the stronger this internal evidence becomes, and the more stable the sense of self trust. At the same time, the absence of repetition creates a very different outcome. When actions are inconsistent, the brain receives mixed signals. Sometimes the action happens, sometimes it does not. This inconsistency prevents the formation of strong patterns, making behavior unpredictable and harder to maintain. The mind remains in a constant state of decision making, which increases resistance and reduces efficiency. Instead of moving automatically into action, it pauses, evaluates, and often delays. This is why inconsistency feels draining. It requires more mental energy because nothing has been stabilized through repetition. As repetition continues to shape the mind, it also begins to influence how time is experienced. Consistent habits create a sense of continuity, where each day builds upon the previous one. This continuity makes progress easier to recognize, even if it is gradual. In contrast, consistent behavior breaks this continuity, making time feel fragmented and progress harder to measure. Without repetition, there is no clear pattern to follow, and without a pattern, it becomes difficult to build momentum. Eventually, the combination of discipline and repetition leads to a state where action becomes less about effort and more about identity. The person is no longer trying to be disciplined. They are simply acting in alignment with what has been repeated enough to feel natural. This transformation is not sudden and it is not dramatic. It happens quietly through daily actions that seem too small to matter at the time, but over time, those actions accumulate, shaping the mind, the behavior, and the direction of life in ways that are far more powerful than they appear in any single moment. Neglect has a way of entering life so quietly that it almost feels harmless. It does not arrive with warning signs or dramatic consequences. It begins with small, seemingly reasonable decisions, a delay here, a skipped action there, a quiet agreement with oneself that something can be done later. In the moment, these decisions feel light, almost insignificant. because nothing immediately breaks. There is no visible damage, no instant loss, no clear indication that anything has gone wrong. This is what makes neglect so dangerous. It operates without urgency, without pressure, and without immediate consequences. It allows a person to feel in control while slowly shifting that control away in the background. The mind plays a central role in this process, not by resisting neglect, but by justifying. It creates explanations that make skipping or delaying feel logical. Thoughts like, just this once, or I'll do it tomorrow, appear harmless because they are emotionally comforting. They reduce pressure in the present moment, offering relief from effort or discomfort. But this relief comes with a hidden cost every time an action is postponed without consequence. The brain records a new possibility that the action is optional. This single shift changes everything. What was once seen as necessary begins to feel flexible, and what is flexible becomes easier to avoid. As this pattern repeats, neglect begins to take shape, not as a single decision, but as a habit. The brain adapts quickly to repeated behavior, whether it is productive or avoidant. When avoidance is repeated, it becomes familiar, and familiarity reduces resistance. This means that over time, it becomes easier to skip than to act. The effort required to perform the task does not increase, but the mental resistance surrounding it does. The task begins to feel heavier, not because it has changed, but because it has been avoided too many times. The mind starts associating it with delay rather than action, and this association makes starting feel more difficult than it actually is. One of the most subtle effects of neglect is how it changes perception of importance. A task that is repeatedly postponed begins to lose its sense of urgency. The mind no longer treats it as something that needs immediate attention. Instead, it becomes something that can always be done later. This shift happens gradually, almost invisibly, but it alters behavior in a significant way. When importance fades, action becomes less likely, and when action becomes less likely, neglect deepens. This creates a cycle that feeds itself, where delay leads to more delay, and avoidance becomes the default response. Over time, this cycle begins to affect more than just one area of life. Neglect rarely stays isolated. Once the mind learns that skipping is acceptable in one area, it becomes easier to apply the same logic elsewhere. This is because the brain prefers consistency in patterns. If avoidance works once, it is likely to be used again. What begins as a small break in one habit can spread into multiple areas, creating a broader pattern of inconsistency. This spread is not intentional, it is automatic. The mind is simply applying what it has learned, repeating what feels familiar. Another interesting aspect is how neglect alters the relationship between intention and action. In a stable pattern, intention leads directly to action with minimal resistance. But when neglect becomes frequent, this connection weakens. A person may still intend to act, may still plan, may still think about what needs to be done. but the execution becomes unset. This gap between intention and action creates internal tension. The mind knows what should be done, but it does not follow through consistently. Over time, this tension can lead to frustration, not because the person lacks ability, but because the connection between thinking and doing has been disrupted. As this gap widens, trust in one's own decisions begins to weaken. Each time an intention is not followed by action, the brain registers inconsistency. It begins to question whether future intentions will be acted upon. This reduces confidence, not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle, accumulating manner. The person may still believe they can act, but there is a growing uncertainty based on repeated experience. This is how neglect affects not just behavior, but self perception. It slowly reshapes how a person sees their own reliability. Alongside this, discipline operates in a completely different manner, where neglect avoids discomfort, discipline accepts it as part of the process. It does not wait for the perfect moment or the right feeling. Instead, it creates a structure where action happens regardless of emotional state. This is what makes discipline powerful. It removes the dependency on motivation. Motivation can be unpredictable, influenced by mood, energy, and environment, but discipline remains steady because it is based on decision rather than feeling. Discipline also simplifies behavior by reducing the need for constant negotiation. When an action is part of a routine, the mind does not have to repeatedly decide whether to do it. The decision has already been made in advance. This reduces mental friction and makes it easier to act consistently. Instead of debating with oneself, the person simply follows the established pattern. This shift from decision making to execution is one of the most important aspects of discipline. It allows action to continue even when resistance is present. Another key aspect of discipline is its ability to recover quickly from interruption. Unlike neglect, which uses a single break as justification for further avoidance, discipline treats interruptions differently. A missed action is not seen as failure, it is seen as a temporary disruption. This perspective prevents one mistake from turning into a pattern. Instead of allowing a break to grow, discipline focuses on returning to the routine as soon as possible. This ability to reset quickly is what keeps discipline stable over time. As discipline continues, it begins to rebuild the connection between intention and action. Each repeated follow through strengthens this link, making it more reliable. The mind starts to expect action to follow intention, reducing hesitation and increasing consistency. This creates a sense of alignment where thoughts, decisions, and actions begin to move in the same direction. This alignment is powerful because it reduces internal conflict. Instead of feeling divided between what should be done and what is actually done, the person experiences a smoother flow between the two. Over time, discipline also reshapes how effort is perceived. What once felt difficult begins to feel manageable, not because the task has changed, but because the mind has adapted to performing it regularly. Repetition reduces resistance, and reduced resistance makes action feel lighter. This does not mean the task becomes easy, but it becomes familiar, and familiarity removes much of the hesitation that usually surrounds effort. The person no longer sees the action as something difficult to start, but as something that is simply part of their routine. Eventually, discipline transforms from something that requires effort into something that provides stability. It becomes a reliable structure within daily life, something that continues regardless of external circumstances. This stability creates a sense of control, not through force, but through consistency. Even when other areas feel uncertain, the presence of disciplined action provides a foundation that keeps progress moving forward. And in this steady continuation, discipline quietly replaces the patterns of neglect, not through dramatic change, but through repeated, consistent action that gradually reshapes behavior and direction. Small actions have a way of hiding their true impact behind their size. A few minutes of effort rarely feel important in the moment. They don't create immediate results, they don't attract attention, and they don't give the satisfaction that comes from completing something large or dramatic. Because of this, the mind often undervalues them, treating them as optional or insignificant. But what is not immediately visible is how these small actions accumulate over time, quietly building momentum beneath the surface. Each repetition adds a layer, and while one layer may seem meaningless, many layers begin to create something solid. This is how small actions transform into powerful outcomes, not through intensity, but through accumulation that continues without interruption. The interruption, in part, is that the mind does not naturally think in terms of accumulation. It prefers immediate results, clear feedback, and visible progress. When those are absent, it becomes easy to lose interest or underestimate the value of what is being done. 5 minutes today does not feel connected to 5 minutes tomorrow, and neither feels connected to a result that may appear weeks or months later. But in reality, they are deeply connected. They form a chain of actions that gradually shape behavior, thinking patterns, and direction. The problem is not that small actions lack impact, but that their impact is delayed and therefore harder to perceive in real time. As these small actions repeat, they begin to influence more than just the specific task being performed. They start to affect how a person approaches effort in general. Consistency in one small area creates a sense of structure that begins to spread into other areas. The mind starts recognizing a pattern of follow through, and this pattern becomes easier to apply elsewhere. This is how a small habit can expand into a broader system of discipline. It does not remain isolated because the brain prefers consistency in behavior. Once it learns that repetition is normal, it becomes easier to repeat in different contexts. Another layer to this is how small actions reduce the barrier to starting. Large tasks often feel overwhelming because they require significant time, energy, and focus. But a small action feels manageable It lowers resistance because it does not demand much in the moment. This makes it easier to begin, and beginning is often the most difficult part of any process. Once an action is started, it creates momentum, and that momentum can sometimes extend beyond the original 5 minutes. Even if it does not, the act of starting still reinforces the pattern of action over avoidance. Over time, this repeated. Starting becomes a habit in itself, making it easier to take action consistently. As accumulation continues, something subtle begins to change in perception. What once felt like a small effort starts to feel like part of a larger system. The mind begins to conscious process. Instead of seeing each effort as separate, it starts to see them as part of an ongoing pattern. This shift is important because it changes how progress is experienced. Progress is no longer tied to single moments of achievement, but to the continuation of the pattern itself. The focus moves from results to repetition, and this makes consistency easier to maintain. At the same time, small actions begin to build a sense of reliability. Each completed action becomes evidence that intention leads to execution. This evidence accumulates, creating a track record of follow through. The mind uses this track record to form expectations about future behavior. If actions have been repeated consistently in the past, the brain begins to expect them to continue in the future. This expectation reduces hesitation and strengthens commitment because the person is no longer relying on motivation alone. They are relying on a pattern that has already been established. Over time, this accumulation starts to produce visible results. But by that point, the most important changes have already happened internally. The person has developed consistency, reduced resistance, and built a system that supports continued action. The external results are simply a reflection of what has been happening beneath the surface all along. This is why small actions can lead to outcomes that seem disproportionate to their size. The visible result is not just the product of the most recent action, but of all the previous actions combined. Alongside this, there is an important realization about where the real challenge lies. It is easy to assume that obstacles are external lack of time, lack of resources, or difficult circumstances. But in many cases, the real challenge is internal. It exists in hesitation, inconsistency, distraction, and the tendency to delay action. These internal barriers are often less visible, but they have a stronger influence on behavior than external factors. This is why the idea of an internal battle becomes so significant. The struggle is not always against something outside, but against patterns within the mind that resist consistency. This internal struggle is shaped by habits, thoughts, and repeated decisions. When avoidance is practiced, it becomes easier to avoid. When action is practiced, it becomes easier to act. The mind adapts to whichever pattern is repeated more often. This means that the outcome of the internal battle is not determined by a single moment of strength, but by the direction of repeated behavior over time. Small actions play a crucial role here because they are the building blocks of these patterns. Each action reinforces either discipline or avoidance, depending on what is chosen in that moment. As awareness of this internal process grows, it becomes clear that control is not about eliminating difficulty, but about managing response. Challenges, distractions, and resistance will always exist, but the response to them can be shaped through repetition. When a person consistently chooses action despite resistance, they train the mind to move forward instead of stopping. This does not remove resistance, but it reduces its influence. The mind begins to understand that resistance does not prevent action, it simply accompanies it. Over time, this repeated response begins to change how challenges are perceived. Instead of being seen as obstacles that block progress, they are seen as normal parts of the process. This shift reduces fear and hesitation, making it easier to continue even when conditions are not ideal. The person becomes less dependent on external circumstances and more reliant on internal patterns. This is where stability begins to form, not because the environment has become easier, but because the response has become more consistent. Eventually, the focus shifts away from individual actions and toward the system that produces them. The person is no longer reliant on occasional effort or bursts of motivation. They are operating within a structure that supports continuous action. This structure is built from small, repeated behaviors that have been reinforced over time. It does not require constant attention because it has become part of how the person functions. And within this structure, the internal battle becomes less intense, not because it has disappeared, but because it is being managed through consistent, repeated action that continues to move forward regardless of temporary resistance in the end. Everything comes back to one simple but powerful truth. Life is not shaped by big moments alone, but by the small actions that are repeated every single day. What feels insignificant now can become transformational over time, and what feels harmless, like neglect or delay, can quietly weaken direction without being noticed. Discipline, consistency, and awareness are not dramatic forces, but their steadiness is what builds real change. The real difference is created in the moments when no one is watching, when the choice is small, and when it feels like it doesn't matter, because those are the moments that slowly define everything. Thank you for watching this video. Oh, if you found this helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content like this. Your support truly means a lot. See you in the next video.